Hey, it is Sunday, January 6th, 2019. This is Seaside Chats with Kenneth Arthur, and this is the Postmortem show for the Seattle Seahawks. The 2019 season is over after the Seahawks lose 24-22 to the Dallas Cowboys in the wild card round on Saturday night. The Seahawks had this game at points, perhaps up 14-10. The defense doing enough on the road for much of the game to give the Seahawks a 14-10 lead in the fourth quarter. But the Cowboys come alive enough to go up 24-10 or 24-14. The Seahawks score 8 points, make it 24-22. But ultimately, there's not really any hope of an onside kick. Once the Seahawks had only one timeout remaining, that game was pretty much over. They had 3rd and 14 on Dak Prescott. If they stop Dak Prescott, they get the ball back. 6-point deficit. At that point, of course, Dallas was not doing a good job of stopping the Seahawks on defense on the ensuing drive. Would the same things have happened? I don't know. Probably not. But at the same time, it doesn't mean that they wouldn't have scored. And, that's the way that the football goes sometimes. And the Seahawks lose. Their season's over. They won't be traveling on the road for a divisional game. It'll be the Dallas Cowboys doing that. And that's okay. We can assess and move on and talk about the good and the bad in the Seahawks 2019 season and what happened on Saturday night against the Dallas Cowboys. And keep in mind, one thing to not forget, the Seahawks had a playoff game, not something that they had last year, not something that a lot of people had chosen them or picked them to have going into this season. And certainly we can have revisionist history that gives them more wins or more losses this season, but they go 10-6. They've got some nice pieces to build around that maybe you didn't know that they had before. And they go into the offseason with, a good amount of cap space. They've got to figure out what to do with it. 54 million effective cap space, 62 or 63 million in total cap space. Effective cap space, essentially just meaning once you assess 51 players under contract at the bare minimum, maybe at most they have 54 million. But when they release Cam Chancellor, which they are expected to do, 8 million saved against the cap. That's another 8 million that they can use. They've got some free agents to look at. We'll get into the free agents. This is Kenneth Arthur. I am going to be doing a little bit of a solo show here today, it seems. So this is the instant reaction / post-mortem. Quickly getting into the game last night, you already know what happened. The Seahawks lose 24-22. A lot of complaints about the play calling by Brian Schottenheimer, offensive coordinator, and Pete Carroll, who, essentially this is the game plan that Pete Carroll wants to run. So I don't know that we can really solely credit with Brian Schottenheimer with the game plan. This is what Pete Carroll would not have asked him to, if things needed to be changed going into the fourth quarter or in the second half to a certain degree. And I think that they were, then, Pete Carroll would have said so. And then Schottenheimer likely would have done so, or Russell Wilson, could have checked out and done something else. But at the end of the day, Russell Wilson goes 18 of 27 for 233 yards, 8.6 yards per attempt. He's sacked one time. He has a touchdown there at the end, like I said, to make it 24-22. They convert a 2-point conversion twice, actually. They converted two 2-point conversions once Sebastian Janikowski is injured at the end of the first half. And again, what would have happened if they had gotten, maybe if Brett Maher doesn't tackle Tyler Lockett, does he score a touchdown to end the first half? Does he get into a much closer field goal range in which Janikowski can maybe make that kick and maybe doesn't put enough leg into it to hurt himself on that kick? But at the end of the day, what happened is what happened. And, I think in a bigger picture, I can say that I can sort of watch and enjoy football without needing the Super Bowl to justify why I watch the whole season. There's other reasons to watch all season, and I'm glad that the Seahawks got a playoff game. I'm sad that they lost that playoff game, but I am glad that it happened, and it gives the team an advantage, I think, to see more about what they can do and what they want to do going into next year. I think always more games gives you more tape, gives you more opportunities to assess what you want to change and do next year. And certainly, I think this is one of the best learning experiences that the Seahawks and Pete Carroll could have had. So, to go into a game and have this much consternation, if that's a word, or frustration, or seeing Chris Carson coming out of being the NFC Offensive Player of the Month in December, carries it 13 times for 20 yards. And do you put that on Chris Carson? I mean, I don't think so. There was so much, just like on any running back, there was so much of a mess at the line of scrimmage. He was asked to do so much. Everything seemed like it would have to be a broken tackle. All of his yards seemed like they would have to be after contact. And there was so much made of the offensive line. I think, it was said that probably both J.R. Sweezy and DJ Fluker were playing quite injured in this game. They couldn't feel comfortable going with Ethan Pochik, which is obvious why not. And, there was just such a mess at the offensive line. That said, Rashad Penny did have 4 carries for 29 yards. Rashad Penny breaking out a couple things, but Rashad Penny just getting the 4 carries. And, some complaints about, throwing him a pitch which right after a big gain, they pitch it to him and then he loses yards. And this team did lose yards in really inopportune times on offense, going back after big gains. It seemed like every positive play, like really positive play, was followed up by a fairly negative play. And then including at the end when they had that opportunity to potentially take the lead after KJ Wright makes a phenomenal play to intercept Dak Prescott in the end zone. The Seahawks get the ball back at the 20. And, then there's a holding penalty, and then that holding penalty is followed by a personal foul penalty, and those are going up against Justin Britt and DJ Fluker. And as I'm writing, I wrote an article after the game you can check out on Field Goals that just sort of talks about the problems that the Seahawks had and the what ifs in terms of finishing out games, because if they'd been able to finish out a couple more games this year, they're not going on the road in the wild card round. In fact, if they finish out their 2 games against the LA Rams, both games that they could have won, they are potentially the number 2 seed in the NFC, and they're waiting out this week, and they're waiting for someone to come to Seattle next week, and it's a whole different ball game. And it's not that big of a stretch of the imagination to see the Seahawks winning those games against the LA Rams. It's quite easy, actually, and it's easy to see how if they had changed up some things against the 49ers and their loss to the 49ers in overtime, that's another win that they could have had. The way they played against the Denver Broncos in the fourth quarter is a win that they could have had and they didn't have. The Chicago Bears and the LA Chargers, the LA Chargers, they had 1st and goal with no time left on the clock, but if they score a touchdown and get a 2-point conversion, then they could be going into overtime against the LA Chargers. And what happens? They get a false start penalty, I believe, on Justin Britt. And, it's over and over and over again, whether it was Jermaine Ifedi or Justin Britt or DJ Fluker or Ethan Pochik or J.R. Sweezy, all 5 of those guys. And that's 5 guys. That doesn't include Dwayne Brown. So we're even going deeper into the depth chart here to find penalties and holding calls and false starts and personal foul penalties and just, sacks allowed and key fourth quarter drives. It happened over and over and over again. And so for me, one of the biggest takeaways from the 2019 season or 2018 season will be the play of the offensive line. And I know a lot of people had spent all year talking about how much Mike Solari had changed the offensive line and how much different it was with, Solari and the addition of DJ Fluker. And I know that in going down this road, I feel like I won't have a lot of people following me down this road, but that's okay. I still would say, isn't it interesting? This was a team that last season in 2017, when the offensive line was the subject of so much frustration and, ultimately Tom Cable got fired, were 11th in pass block win rate. And that's with half a season of Reese Adiyambo at left tackle, followed by the acquisition of Dwayne Brown. And then after the acquisition of Dwayne Brown, the offensive line was, pretty good. It was fairly average, and they were doing a decent job of protecting the quarterback and doing the things that they needed to do. Obviously, the Seahawks were the worst running team in the NFL last season. And that's something that changed this year, of course. And that's something that, needs to be discussed and examined and see how much of the offensive line changes was responsible for that versus the changes at running back with getting Chris Carson back healthy. He's a much better running back, obviously, than Eddie Lacy and Thomas Rawls at this stage in their career. The addition of Rashad Penny, the full season of Mike Davis, could some of those things have come into play? The addition of Ed Dixon at tight end or Will Disley at tight end earlier in the year, using Nick Vannett more than using Jimmy Graham prior to last year, and seeing all those things come into play, and then also just realizing, okay, at the end of the day, they were 11th in pass block win rate, and this year they were 8th in pass block win rate. So what was the big difference? I mean, I think that the main thing that helps the Seahawks offensive line is Dwayne Brown, and every other piece on that offensive line, not including the tight ends and those blockers. I think that you can ask questions about it. That includes all the other starters on the offensive line. That includes the depth on the offensive line. That includes the offensive line coach. That includes the offensive coordinator. That includes Pete Carroll. I think it's fair to ask questions about all those. You know, Russell Wilson was sacked a career high this year, and last night he was only sacked once, you know, but I think clearly there was a lot of disruption. The Dallas Cowboys were able to stop the run game totally. The Seahawks finished 24 carries for 73 yards. And, you know, people wanted, I guess, more pass attempts by Russell Wilson. You know, he had 27 pass attempts, and I think they wanted them earlier in the game. They didn't want to see run, pass. They didn't want to see run, pass. And it's all fair questions to be asking. But at the end of the day, I think, you know, there was a lot that could be done over the course of the season with how can the Seahawks clean up these penalties on the offensive line? How can they make the offensive line and Russell Wilson and the offensive game plan reduce those sacks from, you know, 58 or whatever it was down to a more reasonable, you know, 20 or 25? That would be a question that the Seahawks can be asking themselves as they approach the offseason in terms of what changes that they want to make, because they will have to make some changes. I don't think they're going to make drastic changes like they did last year, and seeing so many players leave and seeing the coaches leave or get fired. I think that obviously I don't expect Brian Schottenheimer to be going anywhere at offensive coordinator. That would be surprising to me. Obviously, I don't expect Mike Solari to be going anywhere, and I don't think most people would want to see Mike Solari go anywhere, and I don't think that Mike Solari does need to go anywhere. I just think that the play of, or the impact of the offensive line coach has been as overrated with Solari perhaps as it was with Tom Cable. It's just that instead of being negative, it's positive. And I think at the end of the day, what they really need is better offensive linemen. And a lot of people, as we approach, and we'll get into the free agents again, like I said, but as we approach free agency, a lot of focus will be on DJ Fluker as the number 2 priority after Frank Clark, or at least one of the top 3 or 4 priorities. Maybe J.R. Sweezy coming in closely behind him. And my question to anyone who thinks that or wants to believe that, and I think that that's a fine thing to believe, but my question to you would be, is that good enough? You know, is that the status quo that you want? Because it is the same sort of status quo that they had with James Carpenter. I don't see a lot of evidence, or I haven't seen any evidence that says perhaps that like DJ Fluker is a better guard than James Carpenter was for the Seahawks. And also remember that the Seahawks won a Super Bowl putting in Paul McQuiston quite a bit. And like it's the offensive line itself can take focus. And I think that that's fair to say that, you know, good offensive lines like the ones that we have seen with the New Orleans Saints or this year with the Indianapolis Colts do help the offense quite a bit. And you want your quarterback to have time. You don't want him to get sacked plays. And we don't want to see those negative holding penalties and personal foul penalties and false start penalties. And these are the types of things that the Seahawks should be trying to clean up. But last night, and in all of their losses, fourth quarter penalties and sacks allowed by the offensive line, or, you know, if you want to put it on Russell Wilson, but either way, those sacks and especially those penalties just killed drive after drive after drive. It happened last night again against the Dallas Cowboys. As they could have had the opportunity to go down the field, get some points, and, you know, make this a game again. I think they were down 17-14, right? So they could have they couldn't have gotten a field goal because of the injury to Sebastian Janikowski, but we saw how quickly they moved down the field once they did start throwing it a little bit more there in the fourth quarter. And, you know, once they couldn't get that drive going, once they couldn't stop Dak Prescott on that 3rd and 14 run, the game was over. And that's pretty much it, because you're not going to recover an onside kick in 2018, and especially not asking a rookie punter who doesn't do kickoffs or onside kicks, you know, and just started punting 3 years ago to make an onside kick that's really recoverable when, you know, it's just really hard to do. So especially now. So the Seahawks, for them, you know, if it's just a matter of how do they get better, I don't think they get better by keeping the status quo on the offensive line. You know, I think they've got to start figuring out, or, you know, not start, because they've been trying to figure it out for a while, but they've got to look and say, well, how do we make this a good offensive line instead of one that, and even if they were 8th in pass block win rate, there's still that 11th in pass block win rate that they were a year ago. So if that's the stat that you want to use, you also have to, sort of talk about why that stat was pretty much the same the year before, with Tom Cable as the offensive line coach and without, DJ Fluker and GR Sweezy at the guard positions. And if it's the improved running, we also have to isolate the running backs and talk about that, as well as the game plan and the focus on the running game, the addition of the tight ends, the drafting of a running back, the change at offensive coordinator, the additional, early runs that the Seahawks had this year, and talk about maybe that how much of that had an impact on the improved running, as opposed to just the addition of DJ Fluker, who, by the way, missed 4 or 5 games and was, injured for in 2017 when he was with the New York Giants, was injured, so it's also a matter of, can they go into next year with signing a oft injured guard who did not have a ton of success, early on in his career. And, with offensive line, it's always somewhat debatable, but I don't think that there's, so it's going to be up in the air, and people can debate the impact of DJ Fluker and J.R. Sweezy. But how much can you isolate them? How much can you say, I know for sure that these guys had X amount of impact compared to the players before them? And I don't know, because, Jordan Simmons, when he came in as an undrafted free agent, in 2017, who then signed with the Seahawks later on, coming out of USC, in his 2 starts at right guard, I think you could argue he looked as good, if not better, than DJ Fluker. And it's a question that the Seahawks have to say. And I don't think that Jordan Simmons is the answer that you go into next year because of his long history of injuries. But I do think that it's a matter of, can they find how many of those other guys that they want to find? And how much is DJ Fluker and J.R. Sweezy going to cost? I'm sure J.R. Sweezy, I would assume, and both of these guys, DJ Fluker, 1 year, $1.5 million, didn't have a high value coming into this year. He comes in, he misses the first 2 games. He misses games at the end of the year. He is probably injured in this playoff game. What do those injuries cost him in financial guarantees? And then the Seahawks have to look at it, and the Seahawks have to look at it and say, okay, well, are we willing to put $7 million next year into DJ Fluker? Is that what DJ Fluker wants? Is it going to be $4 million? Maybe $4 million is more manageable. But I think at $4 million, then you're talking about potentially having other options besides DJ Fluker at guard. And I think you have to have other options at guard besides DJ Fluker because of his injury questions. And I think we also have to question, the actual absolute value. And we also have to look at the Seahawks history with the guard position, because the Seahawks history with the guard position, even if you disagree with it, other than their attempt to sign TJ Lang, which we found out after TJ Lang signed with the Detroit Lions, the Seahawks were not willing to match the market or whatever the amount that a guard of his caliber at that time wanted to receive. They do not sign guards to a lot of money. They drafted Russell Okung with their first pick when John Schneider and Pete Carroll came to Seattle. They paid him a lot of money. They had money. They paid him a lot of money because at that time, rookies, first-round picks could sign for inordinate amounts of cash. There wasn't a limit, and they paid Russell Okung. When Russell Okung's contract became expired, they opted not to pay Russell Okung, and I think that could be deemed a mistake that the team made because even though Russell Okung had dealt with injuries and some penalty problems in his career, the drop-off over the next 2 years was significant, up into the point where they had to trade, that second-round pick and more to acquire Dwayne Brown. And once they got Dwayne Brown, then their offensive line and production and like all this kind of stuff did get better. And I think Dwayne Brown is the one guy on the offensive line who doesn't present any negative issues really for the Seahawks whatsoever. So, that's something that they had to address. But outside of that, they'll spend first-round picks on linemen. They'll spend second-round picks on linemen, Justin Britt, Ethan Pochik, Jermaine Afidi, so on and so on. Like, they'll spend that. But once those guys become free agents, we've seen a lot of them, they just said, okay, well, we're going to move on. And Max Unger, they were willing to trade Max Unger. And you can disagree with all this, but historically speaking, you can disagree with their decision, but you can't disagree with the fact that they are doing it. So I just don't see the Seahawks spending a ton of money. I see them continuing to go down this path where their belief is that they need to spend money at other positions and skimp on guard and right tackle. So I still see them perhaps working with Jermaine Ifedi at right tackle. They could potentially make a move at center to see if they want to make any money. I don't know that they can save any money with Justin Britt because as I'm currently looking at it, overthecap.com, I think that they, as of a few moments ago at least, there was some of the stuff is down. So, but I do think I can find out. So with Justin Britt, they could save just $2 million by trading or releasing him, while they'd still have $5.8 million in dead money. So I wouldn't expect them to make a move at Justin Britt. And so they could probably go into next year with Dwayne Brown at left tackle and Justin Britt at center and Jermaine Ifedi at right tackle. Unless you want to have George Fant take over that job at right tackle, put Jermaine Ifedi back for an offseason at right guard. Hope he played better at right guard than he did earlier this year when they made that move of Fant at right tackle and Ifedi at right guard. And then, see what else they want to work in, whether it's re-signing J.R. Sweezy, hoping that Jordan Simmons is healthy, seeing if they can ever get something out of Ethan Pochik or Joey Hunt at guard. Even though both, were centers, it's a complicated situation, but I do think that we can't completely ignore or overlook or gloss over or just assume that the offensive line was markedly better than it was in 2017, because outside of the running game, which again, a lot of other factors can come into play, I think we have to talk about and focus on how can, instead of being the status quo of this is the offensive line, how can we say, how can it get better? Whether that's spending another first round pick on a lineman, which I'm sure is on the table for them as it is every year. I still expect them to trade down. So they lost last night. So that means that they'll probably be picking 21st or 22nd or 23rd or something like that. So if they're picking 22nd, 23rd, I would still expect them to trade down as they do every single year. And I would still expect them, especially again, they traded a second round pick for Dwayne Brown, so they need to recoup some more day 2 picks probably, or at least try to, or day 3. But I would definitely expect them to be looking at offensive linemen again. And then, free agency, just as they did, they waited, that's the other thing. It's something that happens every year. Teams wait sometimes for guards, and it happens late in the year. The Seahawks spent $1.5 million on DJ Fluker. He was out there. They probably want to try and do that again. It's not so much always trying to repeat the move exactly. It's about trying to repeat the move, which is finding the cheap player. That's what the Seahawks typically try to do. It's not, well, this was the guy, so this means that we need to repeat with this guy. This was the move. How do we repeat this move? If you can get a guard that you think was capable of the job at $1.5 million, can you do that again, as opposed to avoiding the $5 to $7 million that you might have to spend on DJ Fluker potentially? And again, I don't know that DJ Fluker will ask for that. I don't know that DJ Fluker will get that based on his injuries this year. And then with J.R. Sweezy, he was signed in August. There was plenty of time. Any team could have signed J.R. Sweezy. He was out there. I would think that they would let J.R. Sweezy go out on the market and see what his value is again after the first time he left the Seahawks and, signed a fairly large deal with the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. And then that didn't work out. Injuries took away a lot of his career there, comes back to Seattle. So I think both of those guys, they can let test out the market. And then also the Seahawks want to be on the market, and they want to try and find a way to try to spend less than $3 million on their starting guards. I mean, doesn't everybody want that? Can we not, doesn't everybody want to try and see if the team can do that? Because they're going to need money to be able to retain some of the starters that are about to hit free agency. Let's talk about that really quick. On fieldgoals.com, you can read the full list of free agents, and I'll read it out here now, but you can read it with your eyes. And I think that's a fun thing to do with your eyes, is to read things. And fieldgoals.com, place to read things. Obviously, the biggest free agent for the Seahawks is Frank Clark. He had 14 sacks this year, the most by a Seahawks since Patrick Kearney in 2007 when he had 14 and a half. Frank Clark had a sack against the Cowboys on Saturday night. He got better and better. He had a really good December, and I'm sure that Frank Clark will be a player that is a Seahawk in 2019, whether that's because they sign him to a contract or he gets the franchise tag. Typically, players like Frank Clark aren't allowed to leave by their teams. We saw last year DeMarcus Lawrence and Ziggy Ansah both had franchise tags, and they played on those tags this year. Both could become free agents this year. And actually, I would assume, my thought, if the Seahawks were to sign a quote-unquote name in free agency this year, my thought would be someone like Ziggy Ansah, not DeMarcus Lawrence, not Jadeveon Clowney, but a guy like Ziggy Ansah who has had production in the past. The Seahawks have looked around the Detroit Lions quite a bit in John Schneider's tenure. They have a relationship there. They're probably, aware of, that's where they got Cliff Averill. I would think that they are looking at Ziggy Ansah also because Ziggy Ansah, with his own injuries and his inconsistent production, is a guy that actually would be affordable and could be in that second or third wave of free agency. And I'll have more on free agency later on this month on field goals because, I have some opinions there, which basically set around the fact that free agency, that first wave, that Jadeveon Clowney wave of free agency that a lot of people are going to be talking about again, because every year people talk about the big name free agents because that's why they are big names. It's not where the Seahawks live, and it's just not what the Seahawks do. They don't sign those guys. They wait for Michael Bennett and Cliff Averill. Michael Bennett was a 1-year deal. Cliff Averill was a 2-year deal. They came after some time had passed in free agency. Then they want to see what those guys can do, build them up, and then if they perform, sign them to contract extensions. It's what they do pretty much every year. So you should expect that again. I don't know why you're expecting something differently. The Seahawks have never signed a free agent, not in the Pete Carroll and John Schneider era. They've never signed a free agent that's like the big name free agent. They don't do that. They've traded for Percy Harvin and then signed him to a big contract extension. That's pretty much the closest. They've traded for Jimmy Graham. They've attempted to sign DJ Lang. Like I said, they've signed guys like Matt Flynn and Robert Gallery and Sidney Rice. I mean, Sidney Rice might be, and Zach Miller back when they had a lot more, they were a younger team with a lot more opportunity and a lot more things going on where they tried to do how can we be more competitive at this time? Those are decent contracts. Robert Gallery, not that big a contract. Matt Flynn, not that big a contract, relatively, of course. But those are also all in the past. This is not what the Seahawks do. So my expectation, a guy like Ziggy Ansah might be sitting out there and looking at it, and he might find himself signing a 1-year, $7 million deal, sort of like Tyrann Mathieu did last year, sort of like Sheldon Richardson did last year. And that might be the type of player that the Seahawks say, well, we need someone opposite of Frank Clark besides Quentin Jefferson, who is a restricted free agent. I would expect him to come back, but, maybe not. Quentin Jefferson shouldn't be starting on this defense. I don't think they should have another guy that is a quality pass rusher that can actually, put up some sack numbers in the way that Bennett and Averill and Clark did for, the several years that they were together. When the Seahawks won the Super Bowl, it was Bennett, Averill, Clemens, Bryant. That was a much deeper defensive end. So they need Quentin Jefferson to be a backup, I think, and in the rotation. And they need a guy perhaps like Ziggy Ansah, who if he signs for a 1-year deal to try and boost up, show that he's healthy, have some nice sack numbers, get a bigger deal next year in free agency. I think Ziggy Ansah is a guy that I'd be focused on. But Frank Clark, looking at it and looking at overthecap.com, the biggest 4-3 defensive ends in terms of money are, guys like Daniil Hunter, who's coming in at $14 million, Everson Griffin, who's coming in at about a couple $100,000 more than that. And then you get up to Chandler Jones at $16.5 million as the most. So I could see Frank Clark. I think the Seahawks are more of a 4-year type deal team than they are a 5-year or 6-year deal type teams. $68 million, $17 million per year could be a Frank Clark contract, in my opinion. And if that doesn't happen, then a franchise tag, which would be over $17 million for 1 year, is also an option. And Frank Clark's camp or whatever has said that they are okay with the franchise tag. So I would assume Frank Clark isn't going anywhere. I think the better situation, of course, would be tagging or signing Clark to the extension, because he is a pass rusher of note, of caliber, that, you could easily see being one of the top 5 pass rushers in the next 4 years. So, we don't see sack numbers quite like we've seen from a guy like Frank Clark. A lot of people talk about inconsistency, and I agree with the fact that Frank Clark doesn't have a big game every week, but you're talking about maybe 2 or 3 pass rushers in the entire world that do that. You're talking about Aaron Donald, and that just doesn't usually exist. And relatively, Frank Clark is one of the top 10 I think pass rushers in the NFL, especially given his age, given everything that you know about him. A 4-year, $68 million deal is probably fair, and that's probably and all the other issues around Frank Clark, off field, whatever. Given that the Seahawks drafted him, given that the Seahawks defended drafting him, given that Frank Clark has not had any issues since drafting him, I would assume that the Seahawks are going to be fine giving him an extension. And I would think that if they offer him the most money ever given to a 4-3 defensive end at $17 million per year, that I think, maybe that would be enough to get him in there. And then at that point, they have a franchise tag to use if they want to, potentially. And I know, again, more controversy potentially on Earl Thomas, because this is a team that I think suffered on defense after Earl Thomas was out. I am shocked that there were so many people who are anti-Earl Thomas now, who not even being in the camp of like, well, I know that Earl Thomas is an upgrade at free safety, but I just don't like him personally anymore because he gave the middle finger to the Seahawks. And I don't know, but at some point in my life, maybe I think I got over getting the middle finger from someone. I think I was like, oh, okay, whatever. That doesn't mean anything. Who cares? But don't sit here and tell me that Earl Thomas isn't an upgraded free safety monumentally. Don't tell me that he's not a Hall of Fame free safety who still has Hall of Fame years left in him. 29, 30 years old is not the end of the road for an NFL player. It's not the end of the road for an NFL player of his caliber. Free safeties especially are one of the longest, had some of the most longevity in the league. You can see guys like Charles Woodson, who played free safety into 39 and was still a quality player. We've seen Rod Woodson and Ed Reed and so on and so on and so on. At the very least, you would think he has 3 years left. And yes, he has broken his leg twice, but he also didn't have the surgery that he had this previous time. And they've said that the rod inserted into his leg would make him more stable than it was without any sort of, with no broken leg and no rod. So my thoughts are simply that Earl Thomas is an upgrade over Tedrick Thompson. And if you don't believe that, I just don't even know how to relate, because the Seahawks from 2010 to 2018, even if you go 2010 to 2017, how many people were like Earl Thomas defenders? How many people were in Earl Thomas's corner? How many people were like, no, Earl Thomas is a Hall of Famer? How many people were like, Earl Thomas is my favorite player? And then all of a sudden, just because he wanted more financial security in case he broke his leg, as he did, and simply was like, well, this is my right to hold out, because it's your human right. Nobody is forcing anyone to do a job. That doesn't exist. Not in 2018, 2019 in America. You are not forced to do your job. He signed a contract, and he also didn't get paid while he wasn't doing his job. That's how it worked. He was not getting paid. It wasn't like he was stealing money from the company. He chose to sit out, and he lost, millions of dollars or hundreds of thousands of dollars by doing so. Or maybe he didn't because he came back. I don't know exactly how much money he lost. He was fined probably, but he took that risk. And if he didn't play, he didn't. But he still tied for the team lead in interceptions, and he only played in 3.5 games, and he tied for the team lead in interceptions. If you look at the numbers that they put up, and I don't care, the situation that they'll go on, they went on the road in those first 2 games. I mean, the defense was better with Earl Thomas. I don't understand how anybody could say anything differently. The defense was better with Earl Thomas. He was still one of the top free safeties in the league. If he hadn't gotten hurt this year, I have very little doubt that he's going to be considered in that all-pro category. So it's certainly a different question if you want to talk about, well, free safeties don't have that much value. I agree with that. That's why, I think that's the bigger reason why Eric Reed remained a free agent. I think that's the big reason why other safeties were allowed to be signed later in the year, like George Aloka with the Minnesota Vikings. And I have some others up, but I can't think of them all off the top of my head. But don't tell me that Earl Thomas is not much better for this defense than Tedrick Thompson or Delano Hill. I just won't buy that. So that's just not what I want to, I will talk about any other reason for why the Seahawks wouldn't bring back Earl Thomas, but not good enough, not an upgrade, not the defense was built around him. Not he wasn't the second pick. He was the first defensive pick in Pete Carroll's tenure. He was the guy that they had to have coming into that, when they had that 2010 draft. And then by, his second year had really started to get it. And by his third year was the best free safety in the league and then held that position. Earl Thomas has time left in this league. And if he goes to another team, which I do assume that he will do, I don't have very much doubt that he will still be one of the best free safeties in the league. And I don't know how the Seahawks are going to replace him. Maybe they had their opportunity in last year's draft if they, had, there were a couple guys in that draft that have already looked very good. Of course, Derwin James, who was drafted before the Seahawks were on the board. And we know that the Seahawks don't trade up. And if they had tried to trade up for Derwin James, who knows what they would have had to give up. Instead they traded down and picked up a 3rd round pick, which they used on Rasheem Green, which, you can like or dislike. I think we still have to find out what Rasheem Green is. He was one of the youngest players in the NFL. But, and then there was the other guy that I think went to Cincinnati, and I can't think of his name right now. Yeah, there were good safeties, and they missed that opportunity, and maybe there were safeties in this one. I don't really know yet in terms of the 2019 draft, but I don't think that they're going to just find Earl Thomas, and I think that there's a reason why that Earl Thomas has been around for as long as he has, and why the defense has performed so much better in pass defense with Earl Thomas than without him, which goes back to the first time he broke his leg, and that basically eliminated a lot of their chances in the 2016 playoffs. And then this time when, yes, they managed to go 10-6 and make the playoffs, and that's great. And I think that they could manage next year without Earl Thomas, but it's just the difference between managing and being like, damn, we got a really good free safety. Thank God. I know that free safety, we've got Earl Thomas and Bradley McDougald, and then you got Trey Flowers coming up, real nice in this year and his rookie year at cornerback. And then maybe if they re-sign Justin Coleman, and then you got, what's going to happen with Shaquille Griffin. And I think they probably still continue to add to those cornerback groups, and maybe they continue to add. And I think it was nice to see Tedrick Thompson get in a lot of snaps this year. It was nice to see Delano Hill sort of get better as the year went on. And I think that maybe they have more depth than then, but whether or not they bring back Earl Thomas, I would say probably not. And maybe that relationship is fractured. And I think that you can look, I know that the relationship is fractured, but there's those relationships that are fractured that can't be repaired. And maybe that was the case with Michael Bennett. And then there's the ones that can. And I don't know if that's the case with Earl Thomas, but I'll also say that, Earl Thomas as a competitor, as a guy that I think wants to win all the time, is he really looking at the San Francisco 49ers or some team like that and thinking, I got to get in on that? And then the Dallas Cowboys, they're starting Xavier Woods at free safety. I don't think that they want to spend what Earl Thomas wants in money. I don't think that he can go to the Dallas Cowboys, because I don't think the Dallas Cowboys want to give him the money that he would want. And I think that they're perfectly happy with Xavier Woods. So I don't even see that relationship coming together. So that's another consideration, is where would Earl Thomas go? And I'm sure that he would find a team. But, the Seahawks are still the team that he has spent the first 9 years of his career with. They're still a team that are a playoff team. They're still a team where Seattle is the place where he's built his home. And if conversations happen, and I would assume that we'll hear maybe in the next couple months that conversations have happened, then those will be addressed when they're addressed. And I'm sure that Earl Thomas, again, I don't expect him to come back, but if they are able to sign Frank Clark to a 4-year deal, or get him a contract that they don't have to use a franchise tag on him, then it's an option. And I don't see that being a problem as an option. And I think if you did want to bring Earl Thomas back, a franchise tag would be a nice way to do it. Obviously he doesn't want it, but at the same time, maybe Earl Thomas is going to find that his broken leg and the year missed means that he will have to play on a 1-year deal anyway. So he could because maybe on the market, he would find that teams are only offering him a 1-year contract. I don't think that's crazy. Eric Reed spent the whole year as a free agent. So it could be a thing where he doesn't get tagged and he goes out and he doesn't like it. And, maybe he does come back and everything, or maybe he follows Chris Richard wherever Chris Richard goes. Chris Richard, of course, the Seahawks defensive coordinator, longtime DBs coach, now with the Dallas Cowboys, looking to get a lot of head coaching interviews here in the next couple of weeks. If depending on how far the Cowboys get into the playoffs, because I don't think that he can or would interview until after the Cowboys are eliminated. Miami Dolphins, New York Jets, Tampa Bay Buccaneers, all teams rumored to, or have said to be wanting to interview Chris Richard. You look at the Miami Dolphins, and I don't know. They've got Rashad Jones at safety, and I think he's a strong safety, but I could be wrong. The Tampa Bay Buccaneers, certainly a team I think that could use defensive help all over the field, and a guy like Earl Thomas and the New York Jets. They just drafted Jamal Adams. So he's a really great safety already. So that's something to think about, but that's neither here nor there. So the Seahawks, Frank Clark and Earl Thomas. What have I spent 20 minutes talking about two free agents, both of whom are pretty much foregone conclusions? Other free agents for the Seahawks, KJ Wright and Michael Kendricks, the two outside linebackers. Michael Kendricks' future is totally up in the air, depending on what happens with his sentencing for insider trading. So that's something that kind of has to be addressed after his sentencing. KJ Wright is a guy that is, obviously a longtime Seahawk, drafted in 2011. Does the team want to give him a third contract? It's another consideration, and it might be a deal where they let him test free agency and see what's out there and see if he can get a significant deal with a team that might have more cap space and might be able to offer him more money. And if not, maybe KJ Wright does return. And I think the team would want KJ Wright back in so many terms. But we saw last night he played very well against the Dallas Cowboys. Obviously came up with a huge interception that they couldn't capitalize on. But as well as some really big tackles, but it might be a situation too where Michael Kendricks is a lot cheaper, and if he isn't sentenced to jail time next year, maybe Michael Kendricks is the direction that they want to go. Shamar Stephen, defensive tackle, was a starter for most of the year at defensive tackle, so I think Shamar Stephen is a guy that they've talked highly of, and Shamar Stephen is a guy that perhaps they do want to bring back. And will he be like sort of a 3-year deal at $15.5 million or something like that? And are they okay with that? Or do they want to just save some money and see what they have in Poona Ford and Naz Jones and bring in someone else that might be cheaper than Shamar Stephen? In the same way, like I said before, they'll bring in guys on 1 or 2 year deals and try to get the best value out of them rather than trying to pay them, to be honest, pay them what they're worth to someone else. So it'll be interesting to see what happens there. Justin Coleman, probably a priority there at nickel slot, nickel cornerback, slot cornerback, one of the better cornerbacks perhaps at that position in the NFL. What is he going to cost? It's another question. And evaluating other nickel slot corners, it's something that could be: do they want to spend $6 or $7 million on a nickel cornerback? Justin Coleman, again, the acquisition of Justin Coleman was a 7th round pick, and they got him really cheap for 2 years. Do they want to try and find another guy like that? Because Pete Carroll is perhaps the best secondary coach in NFL history. So maybe they can try and find another Justin Coleman, or maybe they will lose Justin Coleman, or maybe they will keep Justin Coleman. Deion Jordan, I don't think he did very much this year. He was a restricted free agent last year, just sort of came in. I think it was a potential when they saw he had, 5 sacks or 4 sacks in 5 games last year, and saying, wow, if this guy can stay healthy and be out there for a whole year, could he be a 12-sack player? Could he be the guy that I was talking about earlier and having that depth at defensive end? And he wasn't, and he didn't have a lot of sacks and didn't have a lot of pass rush, and he just sort of disappeared for long stretches. And he did get injured last year, and there was just so much going on with Deion Jordan that anything more than a 1-year, $1.1 million deal would surprise me, and there would be no guarantees on that deal, in my opinion. And we'll see what happens. Sebastian Janikowski, a 1-year deal that he signed, and any controversy around Sebastian Janikowski or Jason Myers, in my opinion, is ridiculous, because Jason Myers is Jason Myers. Yes, he went to the Pro Bowl this year. Who picked that? Who knew that was going to happen? I would love to hear I would love to have the person send me their tweet that happened in August of last year that said that Jason Myers was clearly on his way to becoming a Pro Bowl kicker, or was clearly a huge mistake to let go. I would love to see those tweets or articles or whatever. So send those to me that says you predicted Jason Myers would be totally better in a long way by Sebastian Janikowski. And then, by the way, Sebastian Janikowski, he kicked game-winning field goals twice against the Arizona Cardinals. He he did make some big field goals, and he also missed a couple field goals, and he missed some PATs. And I'm not saying that Sebastian Janikowski was a good kicker, and I do think they need to replace Sebastian Janikowski, and I think that they will replace Sebastian Janikowski, and the search continues and restarts for a new kicker, and we'll see what that means. If that's drafting one like they did with Michael Dixon, if that means getting a bigger name free agent, which there probably won't be a ton of, like there never are really. The Atlanta Falcons have 2 kickers right now who might be good enough to start for any team in the league, and we'll see if they poach one from Atlanta maybe. But I think obviously the kicking position is open once again. The 2 guards, DJ Fluker and J.R. Sweezy, I talked about them already. Mike Davis, the running back, really probably not likely to return to Seattle, because I think a team out there could give Mike Davis $3 to $5 million per year. You look at maybe someone like Isaiah Crowell, who signed with the New York Jets for something like 3 years and $50.5 million or something, I think. So I think Mike Davis has maybe shown enough to get an opportunity to start, perhaps, and maybe not. Maybe I still, again, like the Seahawks would not be the ones to give him a bunch of money. They've got cheap options right now. They've got a cheap option with Chris Carson, and then they've got a little bit of money put into a first-round pick in Rashad Penny, but not a ton. And I think they'll probably do that. And then they'll probably, there's no reason for them to get rid of CJ Prosise at this point, other than, there's really just no reason for them to do it. They could, but there's no reason for them. They don't save any money, really, by doing so. So they probably just bring CJ Prosise back into camp. JD McKissick is an exclusive rights free agent, so he'll be back. I think the team obviously wants to draft a running back in the late on day 3, probably, or an unrestricted free agency, as they do pretty much every single year. And a lot of those guys turn into interesting players like Thomas Rawls or Chris Carson, or they pick up a guy off waivers like Mike Davis or whatever it is. So I don't think that Mike Davis will be back. Nico Thorpe, one of their special teams players of note. I wouldn't really call him much of a cornerback, so he's just really a special teams player. He'll be a free agent. And then they need probably to address backup quarterback again, as Brent Hundley, I believe, is an unrestricted free agent, the backup quarterback, and they gave up a little bit of a draft pick to acquire Brett Hundley. But so that could either be a player that they liked during practice and all that kind of stuff, because he didn't get any snaps on offense this year. Maybe that's a player they like enough and he re-signs for 1 or 2 years at a really low cost, or maybe they go out again and look for another guy. Alex Magoo was a guy that was on the practice squad all year, and I assume that they'll bring him back. So maybe they feel comfortable giving Alex Magoo a chance, their 7th-round pick last year, a chance to win the backup quarterback job. Their restricted free agents include long snapper Tyler Ott, who I think they would obviously want to bring back. I didn't see any issues there that I could note. Quentin Jefferson, who, as a restricted free agent, probably is worth whatever it would be, $2 or $3 million maybe, to bring him back, given that even though he's not someone that I would want starting at defensive end as a rotational guy against the run, or against, he was somewhat productive as a pass rusher, putting up some QB hits and hurries, but not a big time starter. Brandon Jackson, Akeem King, I think, is a guy that is really interesting and played well at times, I think, and he has some versatility at cornerback and safety. George Fant is a guy that I expect absolutely to be back as a restricted free agent, and a guy that can compete as a starting offensive lineman. Although, there are things to like about George Fant and still things to not like about George Fant. This was people, I think, in their minds still see the athleticism and the potential and the receptions of George Fant and think, oh my God, this guy is such a special player. And yeah, he might be a special human being and he might be a special athlete, but when he was starting, he was one of the worst in the NFL, if not the worst. And then he missed a year. So we have to take that into account. And then he comes back, and a lot of his job was to be the number 6 offensive lineman and to pick up, assignments that they don't typically have offensive linemen pick up, and helping people out. Can he handle that workload on his own? That's not really something that has been proven, and it's fine to believe that it could happen, but don't tell me that it has happened. And we would want to see, and that just depends on what his cost would be. And it might be that if the Seahawks, give him the tag of an original round tender, he was an undrafted free agent. A team might be willing to pay him more than that and sign him away, because offensive linemen are so sparse and are so hard to find. And a team might be willing to make George Fant enough money to a starter or an option at starter. And then the other restricted free agent being Trey Madden, fullback, who pretty much played the whole season, was inactive this week, injured this week against the Dallas Cowboys, so he didn't play. And I don't know what their exact feelings are on Trey Madden and how much they really want to pay him or bring him back. But Trey Madden is the other restricted free agent. And then the exclusive rights free agents include David Moore, J.D. McKissick, Joey Hunt, Austin Calitro, Emmanuel Ellerbe, Jordan Simmons, and Shalom Luani. And I would assume that they could bring all of those guys back. The only guy that we don't know a ton about is Emmanuel Ellerbe, but I would assume all those guys, Shalom Luani played a lot on special teams. Jordan Simmons, as I said before, played well at guard. Austin Calitro played a considerable amount, I think, on defense and is a nice, option there. Joey Hunt seemed to play well in when he replaced Justin Brent for a start this year, seemed to play well. David Moore obviously has a lot of potential at receiver, but has a lot of work to do. No mention of David Moore last night against the Dallas Cowboys, and J.D. McKissick, who did catch a touchdown last night against the Cowboys. So those are the Seahawks free agents for 2019. And just looking more at the other things that the Seahawks need to consider, you can also go on fieldgoals.com and read Mookie Alexander's post last night called, without any mincing of words, the Seahawks need to fire Brian Schneider. Earlier this season, I wrote an article that said the Seahawks need to fire or demote Brian Schottenheimer, which is an article I could probably repost today and get a lot of hits on, because at the time, there were a lot of people that shared that opinion. There were some people that didn't share that opinion, not many, but there were. And then as the season went on, he became more and more well-liked, and that article seemed more and more like, what are you talking about? Look how, quick to judgment you are. But after last night, not a lot of people on the Brian Schottenheimer bandwagon anymore. And yeah, I said bandwagon. But certainly people who have been a lot more vocal and fervent and consistent this year are the ones that don't like Seattle's special teams at all. We talked about Sebastian Janikowski. The coverages on punts and kicks has not been very good. They let that one go against Tavon Austin on Saturday night, that Michael Dixon was able to slow down just enough for Ed Dixon to catch up to Tavon Austin and push him out of bounds, but that one hurt a lot. And even though they have an all-pro punter, they definitely have issues at kicker, at punt coverage, at kickoffs, and I think even, and on punt returns, just a lot of issues there. As Mookie wrote, for the first 4 years under Brian Schneider, they were 2nd, 16th, 3rd, and 5th in special teams DVOA. But this year they were 24th. Last year they were 20th, and the year before that they were 15th. And it just sort of has been a consistent below average to now maybe a bad special teams unit in total. And that's something that they need to maybe address. I don't know how much of an impact Brian Schneider has on that versus personnel. I don't know how much of an impact, Pete Carroll and John Schneider's personnel picks and options and decisions and cuts come into that, because, if it's an issue on coverage, if it's an issue with, say, a lot of people saying that Shaquem Griffin maybe is not the best coverage guy, and he's out there a ton. And, even then he's not out there a ton. I mean, he's a starter on special teams basically. But are they lacking, some of those older guys? And by older, I mean like guys from the past. Who remembers the guy Alex Bannister or Ricardo Lockett? Some of these other guys that made real names for themselves as gunners on the Seahawks. Do they have that anymore? Is Nico Thorpe, is the special teams captain? Again, he's a restricted free agent, or he's a free agent. And the Seahawks need to sort of address whether that's going to be an issue that they think can fix itself through personnel and acquisitions there, and how they're going to maneuver the roster, the 53-man roster, to be able to keep guys who are maybe only great at special teams and not good at anything else. Are they going to be able to do that this year? Or is it something where they do fire Brian Schneider as they did last year with, their big coaching changes at offensive and defensive coordinator? Is that something that Pete Carroll is willing to do this year and letting go of Brian Schneider and putting the blame on him rather than something else? And I don't know. It's one of the more complicated and unknown avenues of football. People, don't really seem to know. And I'm not saying that I do, but it's like there has to be a lot of questions about what impact a special teams coach has, what coverages should look like or do look like, and whether it's a bad coverage, how much of it is blown coverages, how much of it is just freak occurrences, because we know that Michael Dixon is a special punter. He had and even in that one that Tavon Austin returned last night, you heard Joe Buck or whatever say immediately after it came on Dixon's foot, wow, what a punt, what a booming punt. And then it just sort of goes really far, really fast. And then there's just a lot of space open in front of Tavon Austin as he's able to return that kick. So that's one to watch. And I think certainly if they can finally get back to having a steady option at kicker, then I think that'll solve some of the issues. If they are doing a better job of protecting Michael Dixon on his punts, because we saw 2 blocked punts in week 17. We saw, I believe, a block punt earlier in the year. There's some things to clean up there. And then how can they do a better job of, opening up some blocking lanes for Tyler Lockett or whoever it is on punt returns? Kickoffs are pretty much a dead art form in the NFL, but on punt returns, how can they do a better job there? Is it firing Brian Schneider? Maybe it is, but I don't expect any changes with a lot of the other assistant coaches. And, if you have thoughts on who you think should maybe be replaced, whether it's an assistant coach or someone else, I think mostly I'm just talking about assistant coaches, but, throw that in a comment somewhere. It doesn't have to be on Field Goals. It can be on Reddit. It can be on Twitter. It can, make it your Facebook status and tag Chef Boyardee. So, the Seahawks finished the season at 10-6 in a loss in the wild card round. They had the lead in the fourth quarter. Is another game this season that they had in the lead in the fourth quarter that they ended up losing, which I think is still better than losing by 21 points. It's not something that the Seahawks have done this year. Their biggest loss being that 8-point loss to the LA Chargers. Although, the Chicago Bears, I think, beat them even worse than the Chargers did. It was just a very late touchdown that made that game a 7-pointer. But the Seahawks don't get blown out. They're keeping it close, and they did so while moving on from, Richard Sherman and losing Cam Chancellor and losing Earl Thomas and trading Michael Bennett and losing Cliff Averill and, not retaining Sheldon Richardson and not retaining Jimmy Graham and so on and so on and so on and so on and so on. But they go 10-6. They make the wild card round. They have an opportunity to win on the road. They don't finish that opportunity. I think their penalties in the fourth quarter, I think the penalties on offensive linemen specifically, because that's pretty much the biggest ones and the only ones that I'm seeing in the fourth quarter on these drive killing penalties on the offensive line. How do they clean that up? How much do they improve or try to improve their offensive line? Do they retain their guards? Do they not? These are some of the biggest questions going into the offseason in terms of the draft, whether they're picking, 21st, 22nd, 23rd, whatever it is. I think they need to probably still focus on pass rush, which I think is going to be a lot of people's focus in the draft this year. It's a really deep and talented pass rush defensive line class in 2019. So that's something that I think a lot of teams will be looking at. And I think the Seahawks now more than any of the last 5 years have to keep adding to that pass rush. I expect them to re-sign Frank Clark. So they'll have Frank Clark. They'll have Jaron Reed, who I think will probably sign a very lucrative contract extension later on in 2019. So they'll have Jaron Reed. They'll have Frank Clark. They'll have Poona Ford. They'll have, we'll see if Naz Jones becomes a more active and important force on the team in this year, if he makes the team, because, for whatever reason it was, he did not play a lot. The coaches didn't seem to be too high on him as a game day option, which was surprising for a lot of us. Quentin Jefferson is a restricted free agent. Rasheem Green going into a second year, will he sort of step up and become a more impactful player? How much of his potential will be built upon? Because I don't think that we can judge much of anything on his rookie campaign, especially given his age and experience. So we'll see what happens there. But I think beyond all else, they still need to add probably one or two free agent veterans at defensive end, and maybe defensive tackle too. Shamar Stephen, a free agent, and so I still am pointing to Ziggy Ansah as the guy that they could be focusing on because of his unique situation where he is still a young, talented player, but injuries, inconsistency, and maybe a better opportunity could help him build that up if he signed like a 1 year, $7 to $8 million deal. That's sort of what I'm looking at. And then I think they really need to build up that pass rush and get more of pressure on the quarterback in 2019, the season, not 2019, the year, because we're already there. And I think obviously they need to figure out safety, who's going to be their starting safeties next year. Will they re-sign Justin Coleman? Is Shaquille Griffin and Trey Flowers good enough for them to go on to next year with as they're starting outside corners? I think Trey Flowers obviously is a guy that they'll continue to build around at cornerback, but is Shaquille Griffin going to be their option at the other cornerback position? Are they going to re-sign KJ Wright and or Michael Kendricks? These are the big questions on defense. Will Earl Thomas leave? And then offensively, are they going to keep the status quo with J.R. Sweezy and or DJ Fluker at guard? Are they going to try and upgrade those positions, or are they going to let those players walk? They've got maybe some cap decisions to make with, like, say, Ed Dixon or Jaron Brown, both of whom did sign multi-year deals, and Barkevius Mingo all signed multi-year deals last year, which was unique because in 2017 they didn't sign any free agents, outside free agents, to more than a 1-year contract, and they liked all those guys as, I think, value adds to 2 and 3 year deals. So, but they still save considerable money, or at least some money, if they release any of them. So how high are you on the idea of retaining Jaron Brown or Ed Dixon or Barkevius Mingo? I think the big one there would be, the big question there might be Jaron Brown, who did have 5 touchdowns, but maybe wasn't the most, week in, week out option. How many snaps can you give to a guy that doesn't get, 16 to 20 targets per season? So, that's something that they have to take into question. They've got other guys who were injured this year that I think they're still high on, like Amar Darboh, who is still on the roster on the injured reserve list. So Amar Darboh is a guy that they'll probably be bringing back. David Moore, obviously, at receiver. And, whether or not, I think Ed Dixon is a guy that they probably don't move on from, and they want to have like maybe Ed Dixon and Nick Vannett and hopefully a healthy Will Disley come back next year. And that could be, a more potent, if healthy, tight end group. But I still think that they would probably bring in another tight end of note, maybe through the draft or free agency. They've got Tyron Swoops on the practice squad. So the Tyron Swoops is another guy that they've still got around. And I think also, with regards to, adding a little bit more running back depth and quarterback, a backup there. As far as Russell Wilson's contract, a lot of people talk about Russell Wilson's contract, but there's no huge rush. I think he could sign an extension in the offseason, but even if he signed an extension this offseason, likely, the money itself would be coming into account in 2020 and beyond that. And that's where they'll have more wiggle room. The cap will continue to go up, and it's not really a huge concern as far as how the Seahawks move forward with their 2019 roster, which is the main focus here, because I think the Seahawks, maybe coming out of 2017, you would be saying, or even out of 2016, you'd be saying, this is a team that looks like on the downward slope. And I didn't see it that way. I thought it was a pretty even slope, which I guess is not a slope at all. It's more of a plane. So we got the Seahawks, we're on a plane, which is fitting. It's a seaplane. It's a spruce goose. And that spruce goose, I think, is taking off again. This is a team that has a lot of questions and players that could be rotating in and out. But at the end of the day, it's still a team with Russell Wilson and Bobby Wagner and Doug Baldwin, who I don't expect to go anywhere, and Tyler Lockett, who had a phenomenal season and a phenomenal game against the Dallas Cowboys. It's a team that, has a solid left tackle again. It's a team that I think will continue to have Frank Clark and has Jaron Reed and has Trey Flowers and has Bradley McDougald. And all these players are good players and players I think that will continue to be as good or better in 2019. And then they've got some younger guys that we still have questions about and could still continue to get better, like Rasheem Green, and guys that maybe we've forgotten a little bit about, guys like David Moore who continue to get better, guys like Will Disley, and Rashad Penny. And I think the Seahawks are a team that, with the cap space that they have, with their ability to retain the players that they want to retain, will be better next season. This was a team that, whether they would have been overrated at that point or not, could have easily gone 13-3 this season and could have even done better than that. And maybe they would have been an overrated 13-3 or an overrated 14-2. But the truth is that they had those opportunities at the end of many games that they lost to win, just like they did against the Dallas Cowboys. So if they can figure out a way to clean up those penalties, if they can figure out a way to finish games and finish drives and be more consistent in offense and find the right balance that works for them and get more opportunities for, when they're sort of finding themselves, going into the fourth quarter with 14 points or, 10 points at halftime or 3 points at halftime or 6 points, whatever it is, finding ways to instead have 14 or 17 point leads that they feel like they should have, then it's a team that can be as good as they were in 2013. And I think that that's a thing that can happen as soon as next season. They've got the pieces in place. They've got the opportunity ahead of them. I think they've got more cap space in the NFC than any teams besides the 49ers and Cardinals. And they're going to be able to free up some more room beyond that. And I think that this is a team that can compete at the highest level next year. And I think that they're a team that will compete at the highest level next year, given what we know about Carroll and Wilson and Wagner. So that's why I have positive thoughts, and that's why I feel good about the Seahawks right now. I might disagree with some of you folks out there about the ways and that they need to go about that, or in the ways that I believe they will go about that. But that's okay. I have enjoyed this season of the Seattle Seahawks. It's been one that I enjoy watching way more than the years prior to 2012 and prior to 2010, and prior to many of those years with Mike Holmgren, and even some of those years with Mike Holmgren when 9-7 and either out of the playoffs or just a shitty chance in hell at making any advancements in the playoffs were pretty much how every year went. And that's not how I feel about this team. That's not how I feel about Pete Carroll Seahawks. It's January 6th, and I'm already feeling pretty positive about Seattle's chances to make the playoffs next January. And that's just based on the fact that the Seahawks have gone to the playoffs in 6 of the last 7 years, and in the other year they were very close to making the playoffs. So I feel good. I hope you feel good. The Seahawks are a good team, and you should feel that way about them. Don't feel too bad about it. The Seahawks came away. They had an opportunity. It slipped out of their hands a little bit, but it's totally fine. They just got a few things I think they need to rearrange for next year. And no matter what happens next year, I think they're going to be a fun team to watch again because of guys like Wilson and Lockett and Wagner. And we'll see what other things happen, because I have no doubt that even if the Seahawks are not a first wave free agency team, they are a team that makes big moves and big splashes and big headlines every single year. So, you can still feel good about an exciting offseason, I think. So look forward to that. This is Seaside Chats with Kenneth Arthur, and that's me, Kenneth Arthur. Thank you to our sponsors, Injury Legal Center. Before you tune out, please know that Injury Legal Center has been handling cases in California, Nevada, and Washington for over 20 years. So if you have an auto accident or a slip and a fall, call them toll free at 855-631-3830. I also want to say, in terms of our foot bottle giveaway, I picked a winner, but the winner hasn't responded. So maybe I'll have to pick a new winner, and maybe I'll give away another prize this week. Email me at sbnfieldgoals@sbnation.com. Tell me who your favorite Seahawk is. It can be anyone in the world. Tell me who your favorite Seahawk is, and we'll see if we can give away another foot bottle or maybe a different prize this week. Just waiting to see if that person out there responds. If you enjoyed this show, or if you enjoyed this show at all, it'll continue to go on throughout the whole offseason. Go to patreon.com/fieldgoals. $2 a month gets you all the episodes. If you want to donate that much, or, if you want to support us at that level, much appreciated. You don't have to, but that's how you'll get all of the episodes of the podcast. We've got great guests. We got great people coming in, great analysis, And if you just want to support the show and the work that we do too, that's fine. You can donate $2 a month. You can donate $5 a month, whatever you would like or whatever you feel comfortable with, or nothing at all. But much appreciation out there to all of our Patreon supporters for doing so. And we'll continue to bring you this podcast every week. Obviously, the instant reaction won't happen until there's a game, but maybe we'll have some instant reaction after some other notable games and the draft and all this kind of stuff. So Seaside Chats with Kenneth Arthur. Thank you again to Injury Legal Center. These guys have over 2,000 active accident cases and a 98% success rate on verdicts against insurance companies. You want to get at those damn insurance companies? Call Injury Legal Center at 855-631-3830. And that's it for this episode of Seaside Chats with Kenneth Arthur, the Instant Reaction Show. This is Kenneth Arthur. The Seahawks are a good team. Love the Seahawks. Watch the Seahawks. Support the Seahawks to your own degree. I'm not telling you what to do. You can do what you want. Live your life. But that's been it for the show. Come back next time.